15 elite snipers, one target, 12 hours of failure. The hostage was already on his knees when the last marksman lowered his rifle and said the words nobody wanted to hear. "I can't make the shot." 4 miles of frozen mountain between them and the only man who could stop a war. Wind, distance, human shields, every advantage belonged to the enemy. Every second brought the execution closer. Then a woman nobody had ever looked at twice, a weapons technician who cleaned rifles and logged ammunition, quietly set down her clipboard, walked to the firing line, and said she could do what 12 of the Army's best could not. They laughed. She didn't. If this story already has you gripping your seat, follow my channel, hit like, and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The wind came off Blackstone Ridge like something with a grudge. It didn't gust. It slammed, sudden and sideways, carrying ice crystals that scraped exposed skin raw and turned every exhaled breath into a ragged white cloud that vanished almost instantly in the dark. At 0340 hours, the observation post carved into the northeastern face of the ridge was barely warmer than the mountain itself. The heating unit had failed 6 hours ago. Nobody had fixed it. There were more pressing things to be angry about. Colonel Mason Grant stood at the spotting scope with his jaw locked and his hands clasped behind his back, the way he always stood when he was working very hard to appear in control. The scope was trained on a cluster of structures, 4,217 yards across the valley, a converted mining compound that now served as the operational headquarters of Darius Voss and whatever remained of his fractured but still dangerous movement. The buildings were old stone, thick-walled, built for exactly the kind of punishment they were absorbing right now, which was none at all because nobody was shooting at them. Nobody could. Through the scope, Grant could see the light in the second-floor window. He could see the silhouette moving behind it, pacing. He had been watching that silhouette pace for the better part of 4 hours, and each time it crossed the window, his stomach tightened a little more because there was another silhouette, smaller, stationary, clearly restrained, sitting in a chair near the far wall. Ethan Mercer, Deputy U.S. Ambassador to the Regional Coalition, 43 years old, father of 2 daughters, picked up off a mountain road 3 days ago when his convoy hit a blocked pass and the secondary security detail made a decision that would haunt them forever. He was alive. That was the only good news, and even that came with an expiration date that was rapidly approaching. The radio on the folding table crackled. "Falcon, this is Spear 2. Wind reading on my end just shifted again, gusting 31 at the surface, coming out of the northwest now. I've got a possible window in approximately—" Grant cut him off. "What's your confidence level on that window, Spear 2? A pause. Static. Then, "Honest answer, sir? 40%. Maybe." Grant closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them again. "Stand by." Behind him, the observation post held 12 men and 1 woman. Most of the men were standing or crouching near the firing positions. 6 sniper teams cycling through attempts that had, across 12 hours and 15 separate shots, produced exactly 0 results. The problem wasn't equipment. The problem wasn't training. The problem was physics operating at a scale that punished arrogance mercilessly. 4 miles was a number that sounded impossible even when you said it out loud, and the people in that room had been living inside that impossibility for half a day. The record-confirmed long-range kills sat at just over 2,500 yards under controlled conditions. They were at 4,200, on a mountain ridge in the middle of a temperature inversion that was playing games with every atmospheric variable known to ballistic calculation, with a target that refused to hold still long enough for a firing solution to stabilize. Cole Barrett stood nearest the primary position. He was 38 years old, built like something that had survived several things it probably shouldn't have, with a career record that read like the kind of biography a recruiting office would frame and mount on the wall. 2 combat deployments. 41 confirmed long-range engagements. The Army's top-ranked precision marksman 2 years running. He had been the first man to attempt the shot, and the 6th and the 11th. And each time he'd come up empty, the silence in the room had gotten a different texture. Now he was standing with his back against the stone wall and his rifle propped next to him, working through something in his head that his expression wasn't quite able to contain. It wasn't defeat, exactly. It was something more complicated. The specific kind of frustration that comes from being the best at something and suddenly running face first into the outer edge of what the best can do. Barrett. Grant moved to him, kept his voice low. Talk to me. Barrett didn't hesitate. It's not solvable, sir. Not with the equipment we have, not in these conditions. The wind layering between here and the target is stacked in 3 distinct bands, all running different directions. By the time a round clears the 3rd layer, the angular dispersion alone puts it, in English, off target, every time. The math doesn't work. Grant looked at him for a moment. Then he turned and looked at the rest of the room, and the rest of the room looked back at him with the expressions of men who had run out of ideas and were waiting for someone else to produce one. That was when he noticed Lena Cross. She was standing near the equipment table at the back of the room. She'd been there most of the night. She was technically always somewhere in the background, part of the technical support attachment assigned to maintain and service the precision weapons being used. That was her official role. Weapons technician. She cleaned the rifles, tracked the ammunition expenditure, logged the barrel temperatures after each firing cycle, and stayed quiet. She had been staying quiet so effectively for the past 6 months that most of the men in the room probably couldn't have told you her last name without checking a roster. But she wasn't looking at the equipment table right now. She was looking at the spotting scope data on the secondary monitor, the atmospheric readings, the wind plot, the range calculation that Barrett had been working from. And she had a notebook open in her left hand, the kind with the dark green cover that field personnel used for range logs, and she was writing in it, quickly, steadily. Grant crossed the room. She didn't look up immediately, which struck him as either extreme focus or extreme composure, and he wasn't sure yet which one it was. Cross. She looked up. She had dark eyes and a face that didn't advertise anything. No nerves, no performance, just attention. She was 31, though she could have been younger or older without anyone being certain. She'd been with the task force since October. Nobody talked about her unless they needed something serviced. Sir, what are you looking at? She held the notebook so he could see it. Numbers filled the page, columns of them, dense and precise. Atmospheric layering calculations. Wind gradient estimates broken into 6 separate altitude bands. She'd drawn a trajectory curve along the right margin with corrections annotated in small, clear handwriting. I've been running the ballistic model since about, 1:30, she said. I think the firing solution everyone's been using has a fundamental error in the wind compensation methodology. They're calculating a single average gradient across the full distance. That doesn't account for the separate behavior of each air mass in the valley floor inversions. Grant stared at the notebook. Then he looked at her. You're telling me you've been standing back there doing your own ballistic calculations? Yes, sir. While the rest of my team has been attempting the shot. Yes, sir. Something moved in his face that might have been disbelief and might have been the beginning of something else. And? I think the shot is possible. The room had gotten quieter without anyone deciding to make it quieter. Barrett had turned around. 2 of the other snipers had shifted. Nobody said anything yet, but the quality of the silence changed. Lena didn't look at them. She looked at Grant. I'd need to use my own rifle, she said, the one I've been maintaining separately. It's been calibrated for conditions like this, and I'd need about 12 minutes to verify my calculations before I take position. Barrett's voice came from across the room, and it was not unkind exactly, but it had an edge that it probably didn't even realize it had. Your own rifle, Lena looked at him. That's right. You're the armorer. I know what my job title is. We've had 6 trained snipers working this problem for 12 hours. What makes you think? Because you've all been solving for the wrong variable. She said it without heat, without apology, just flat, simple, and direct. You've been compensating for the average wind across the range, but there are 6 distinct air masses stacked in that valley, and they're not moving at the same speed or in the same direction. A round traveling 4,000 yards is going to spend time in each of those layers. You have to calculate for each one separately and then integrate the corrections into a single adjusted holdover. Nobody's been doing that. Silence. Barrett looked at Grant. Grant looked at Barrett. Then Grant looked at Lena. Where's this rifle? She crossed to the secondary equipment locker at the rear of the room and removed a hard case that she clearly knew every inch of. She set it on the table, popped the latches with the efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times, and opened it. The rifle inside was a custom precision build, not a standard issue platform. It had the bones of a large caliber bolt gun, but the modifications were extensive and clearly done by someone who understood the theory behind each one, not just the mechanics. The barrel was longer than standard. The stock had been adjusted at the cheekpiece and the length of pull in ways that were clearly fitted to a specific shooter. The suppressor attached to the muzzle end was a model Grant didn't immediately recognize. "I built that?" Barrett said, and there was something in his voice now that wasn't mockery. It was closer to professional recognition. He walked over to the table and looked at it without touching it. "That's a custom build. Long-action chassis. That's not an armory rifle." "No," Lena said. "It's mine." "You built it?" "I built it." He looked at her. She looked back at him. Then one of the junior soldiers near the wall, a kid named Rios, who had been awake for 30 hours and had long since passed the point where he remembered to manage his expressions, said out loud, to nobody in particular, "She's serious." Someone else laughed. It was brief and quickly suppressed, but it happened. Lena didn't react. She picked up her notebook and walked to the primary spotting monitor and began cross-referencing her calculations against the real-time atmospheric data feed. Grant stood in the middle of the room for a moment, and he thought about Ethan Mercer in that chair across 4 miles of frozen mountain. And he thought about the 12 hours behind them and the narrowing window ahead, and he made a decision that was either going to save a man's life or add another item to a failure report that was already long enough. "Give her the position," he said. Barrett's head came up. "Sir, you said the math doesn't work. She says she's got different math. We're running out of time to be selective about who does the arithmetic." He looked at Barrett directly. "Stand her up." Barrett held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he stepped away from the firing position without another word and moved to the back wall. And the way he moved had the particular controlled quality of a man who is not happy and is choosing not to make it anyone else's problem right now. Lena came to the position with her rifle and took a knee behind it, and the room watched her like they were waiting for something to confirm what most of them had already decided about her. She ignored all of it. The firing position was a low concrete notch in the forward wall of the observation post, reinforced with sandbags and fitted with a bipod mount. She settled behind the rifle with a naturalness that was hard to articulate, not theatrical, not tense, just comfortable, like sitting down in a chair she'd sat in many times before. She found the stock with her cheek, found the trigger with her right index finger, and looked through the scope. "I need current readings on all 6 layers," she said. "Not the average. All 6. And I need someone on the secondary scope tracking the target's movement pattern for the next 10 minutes. I'm looking for behavioral consistency." Nobody moved for a beat. "Now would be helpful," she said, without raising her voice. Specialist Durkin, who was 24 years old and sensible enough to recognize competence when it was speaking to him in a calm voice, moved to the secondary scope. On it, Lena began working. She didn't do it with drama. She did it the way someone does a complicated thing they've practiced until it stopped being complicated. Methodically, quietly, with occasional small adjustments to the scope that were too precise and too deliberate to be anything but real. She had a data card mounted on the rifle's left side where she could read her pre-calculated corrections without looking away from the scope, and she cross-referenced it against the live atmospheric readings in real time, updating the numbers in the notebook with a pencil she held between her left ring and middle fingers. The room found its own silence around her. Barrett watched from the back wall. His arms were crossed and his face was neutral, but his eyes tracked everything she did, and gradually, over the course of those 12 minutes, something in his posture shifted in a way he probably wasn't aware of. "Movement pattern," Durkin said. "Target's been crossing the window in roughly 8 to 12-second intervals, but there's been a recurring pause. He stops at the northeast corner of the room for approximately 4 seconds each time he crosses. Regular, like a habit." Lena noted it without looking up. "How regular?" "Last 7 crossings, every time." "Okay." She was quiet for a moment. "When he stops next, I want to count from you from the moment he pauses. Start at 0. "Copy." The waiting was its own kind of pressure. Everyone in the room felt it differently. Rios shifted his weight from foot to foot. 2 of the senior NCOs exchanged a look that said something about probability and doubt. Grant stood at the secondary monitor with his hands still clasped behind his back and his eyes on the thermal overlay that showed the distant compound in shades of white and gray. Barrett unfolded his arms. It was a small thing. Nobody else noticed. But he unfolded his arms and let them hang at his sides, and he watched Lena cross behind that rifle with an expression that had changed, in some fundamental way, from what it had been an hour ago. "Target is moving," Durkin said. Low voice, steady. "Crossing now. Pause. 0. Lena's breathing slowed to something almost imperceptible. Her body went very still, not rigid, but settled, the way still water settles, deep and unbroken. 1. The room held its breath. 2. Her right index finger moved. 3. The rifle fired. The sound inside the observation post was significant even through the suppressor, a hard, concussive crack that bounced off the stone walls and left a ringing edge in the air. The muzzle climbed slightly on recoil and came back down as Lena cycled the bolt with the practiced speed of someone who had been doing this since before she understood why. Then silence. 9 seconds of it. 9 seconds was a long time when a round was traveling 4,000 yards through 6 stacked air masses across a mountain valley in the dark. Long enough for doubt to settle back in. Long enough for someone in the back of the room to shift their weight and exhale. Long enough for Grant to feel his jaw tighten again. Then Durkin said, quietly without theater, "Target is down." Nobody moved. "Confirm," Grant said. "I confirm. Target is down, not moving." A beat. Northeast corner of the room, exactly where he stopped. The silence that followed was different from any silence that had come before it. It had weight and texture and something running under it that nobody in that room wanted to be the first to name out loud. Lena Cross cycled the bolt again, chambering the next round. She did not look up from the scope. She did not move from the position. Her eyes were already tracking the guards below. "I've got 3 secondary targets at the south perimeter," she said. "They're going to figure out what happened in about 90 seconds. I'd like to work before they do." And then she did. The first guard went down before anyone in the compound understood what was happening. The second dropped 7 seconds later, mid-stride, between 2 vehicles. The third was already moving toward cover when the round found him. Not where he was, but where the calculation said he was going to be. 3 shots. 3 targets. Under 4 minutes. Grant looked at Barrett. Barrett looked at Grant. Neither of them said anything. Behind her, the room had the quality of a place where something had just permanently changed, and everyone in it knew it, and nobody had yet figured out the right words for what that was. Lena kept her eye on the scope. "We need to get a ground team moving," she said. "We have a window, but it won't hold. Whoever's in charge of the extraction force needs to move right now." Grant was already on the radio, but 40 feet away, near the far wall, Barrett stood watching Lena cross, and thinking about the 12 hours before this moment, and the 15 shots that failed, and the way she had been standing at that equipment table in the back of the room since 0130, quietly running numbers that nobody had thought to ask her about. He was still thinking about it when the radio crackled with a transmission that made every person in that room go very still. "Falcon, this is Sierra Mobile. We have a problem." Grant pressed the radio to his ear. His face changed. "Blackstone North just lit up. We're showing 12 vehicles. Repeat, 2 vehicles inbound from the northern approach. Heavy. They're moving fast and they are not ours." Grant looked at the monitor. Then he looked at Lena. She was already adjusting her scope. 12 vehicles. Northern approach. Heavy and fast. Grant didn't repeat it. He didn't need to. The words had already done what they were going to do to the room, tightened every spine, changed every calculation, turned a rescue that was 30 seconds from feeling winnable back into something that could still kill all of them. He pressed the transmit key. "Sierra Mobile, Falcon. ETA on those vehicles? 14 minutes, maybe less. Road conditions are slowing them some, but not enough. We count 12 trucks, mix of technicals and troop carriers. Estimate 40 to 60 personnel. They're running dark. No headlights." Running dark meant they knew where they were going. That meant this wasn't a random patrol stumbling onto something. Someone had called them, and whoever made that call had done it fast, which meant the compound already knew Voss was down, or suspected it, or had a protocol in place for exactly this kind of scenario. Grant lowered the radio. His eyes went to the topographic overlay on the main monitor. The mountain road snaking down from Blackstone North, the extraction corridor his ground team was already pushing through, and the simple, brutal geometry of the situation. His people were going to reach Mercer in approximately 11 minutes, and the convoy was going to reach the valley floor in 14. 3 minutes. That was the margin. 3 minutes assumed everything went right for his team, and everything went wrong for the convoy. Neither of those things was guaranteed. "Durkin," he said, "get me a visual on the northern approach. I want to see those vehicles." Durkin was already moving to the thermal scope on the north-facing mount. "Switching now." A pause. "I've got them. 12 confirmed. Lead vehicle is a technical. Looks like a heavy machine gun mount, crew served. Second and third are covered troop carriers." Grant looked at the distance readout on the scope. The northern road bent around a rock formation approximately 2 miles from the valley floor, a natural choke point where the road narrowed and the terrain funneled everything into a single lane. "Cross." He didn't turn around when he said it. Lena was already at the primary position, still behind her rifle, still watching the compound below where the remaining guards were beginning to register that something was wrong. 2 of them had come out of a side entrance and were moving fast toward the main building, and one of them had a radio pressed to his face. She didn't answer Grant immediately because she was tracking the one with the radio, and then the rifle fired again, and the one with the radio went down mid-stride, and the second guard broke left toward a vehicle, and she let him go because he was no longer the primary problem. "Cross," Grant said again. "I heard you," she said. "Give me the northern approach coordinates." Durkin read them off the thermal overlay. Lena didn't write them down. She held them in her head, did something rapid and internal, then said, "What's the elevation differential between the choke point and this position?" "Approximately 300 meters below us," Durkin said. "Maybe a little less. Wind at that altitude is going to be different from what I've been working with up here. I need a reading from the valley floor if you have it. We've got a weather station at Sierra Mobile's position. Hang on." Durkin keyed his headset, exchanged something brief, and said, "Valley floor is showing 12 knots southwest. Stable." Lena was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "Okay, I can work with that," she paused. "But the choke point is 2 miles. That's farther than what I've been shooting." The room registered that in various ways. Rios looked at the floor. One of the senior NCOs, a master sergeant named Caldwell, rubbed the back of his neck and said nothing. Barrett, who had moved from the back wall to a position closer to the center of the room at some point in the last 10 minutes without anyone noticing exactly when, looked at the northern scope readout and did his own arithmetic with his eyes. "Can you do it or not?" Grant asked. Not unkind, just direct. Lena took a breath. Not a nervous breath, a working breath. The kind a person takes when they're loading up for something that requires full concentration. "I can hit the lead vehicle, disable it at the choke point, block the road, stop the convoy from reaching the valley floor, but I need to know the exact position of the choke point relative to—" "I'll walk you onto it," Barrett said. Everyone looked at him. He was looking at Lena. His face was composed, professional, stripped of whatever attitude had been there before. "I'll be on the secondary scope. Call out what I'm seeing. You adjust. We do it together." He paused. "I've worked convoy interdiction before. I know what to look for." Lena looked at him for a moment. Something passed between them that the rest of the room wasn't entirely party to. An assessment on her part, a sincerity check, the kind of look that decided quickly whether something was real. "Fine," she said. "Get on the scope." Barrett moved without another word. Grant watched this happen and filed it somewhere in the part of his mind that processed things later, when there was time for processing. Right now he had a ground team moving through a dark valley toward a diplomat in a chair and a convoy of fighters coming from the opposite direction, and the only thing standing between those two facts was a woman he'd never properly looked at before tonight, and a sniper who'd spent 12 hours failing before stepping aside to let her work. The Army had sent him to Blackstone Ridge with the best people it had. Grant was beginning to understand that the best people it had weren't necessarily the ones whose names appeared first on the roster. He keyed his radio. "Bravo Team Falcon, update your position." "Falcon Bravo, we're at the east perimeter of the compound. Gate is clear. Your shooter took out the 2 guards on the south face. We're making entry now." "Copy. You have 12 minutes before a convoy reaches the valley floor. Move like it." "Understood. Moving." He put the radio down and listened to Lena and Barrett work. It wasn't what he expected, though he wasn't sure what he'd expected. They had a rhythm almost immediately. Barrett calling distances and reference points off the thermal scope in the clipped, information-dense shorthand that experienced shooters used, and Lena adjusting her scope and making small notations in her notebook and asking occasional questions that were precise and technical and answered without hesitation. Lead vehicle is sitting at 3:30 on the approach. They've slowed. Road's narrowing. How tight is the road at the choke point? One lane, hard rock face on the left, drop off on the right, maybe 8 feet of clearance. If I kill the lead vehicle's engine, does it block the road completely? Barrett studied the thermal image. Depends on where it stops. If it goes crosswise, yes, full block. I'd need to hit the engine block on the right front quarter, make it veer left into the rock face. A pause. That's a specific shot. Yes. At 2 miles with valley inversion, I know what it is. Not sharp, not defensive, just factual. Barrett was quiet for a moment. Then, right front quarter of the lead vehicle. I'll call the moment it hits the straightest section of the approach. Good. Caldwell had drifted forward without fully meaning to. He was standing behind Lena now, close enough to see the scope data and the notebook calculations, and his expression was the expression of a man who was recalibrating something he'd had set a specific way for a very long time. He'd been with the task force 7 months. He'd never once asked Cross what her background was. The thought now struck him as a specific kind of negligence, and he put it away because there wasn't anything to do about it at the moment. Rios, behind him, leaned toward the soldier next to him and said in a voice barely above a breath, "Where did she even come from?" The soldier, whose name was Park and who had been in the army 5 years longer than Rios, replied without looking at him, "She's been here the whole time." Rios thought about that. At the firing position, Lena was making her final adjustments. The scope turrets moved in small, deliberate increments. 3 clicks here, a half turn there. And each adjustment came from the notebook in front of her, from calculations she had been running and updating since before anyone else in the room had thought about the northern road. She wasn't improvising. She had been thinking 4 or 5 steps ahead of the situation since 0130, which meant that the problem everyone else had just discovered was a problem she had already been solving. That was the part that Caldwell kept turning over in his head. Not the shot itself, the preparation. The hours of quiet work at the back of the room while everyone else focused on the primary target. Who thought like that? Who sat in the background running contingency calculations for threats that hadn't materialized yet? Someone who'd been trained to was the answer. But trained by whom, and where, and when? Those were questions that didn't have answers yet, and Caldwell was aware that he was only asking them now because events had forced him to notice someone he'd been actively ignoring for 7 months. That was on him. He knew it. He put it away again. "Vehicle is entering the straightaway," Barrett said. 400 yards to the choke point. Speed is down. They know the road. Call it when the front axle clears the last bend. Copy. A pause. 15 seconds. Lena's breathing went shallow and even. Her right hand settled around the grip and her index finger rested against the trigger guard. Not the trigger. Not yet. Her left hand was forward on the stock, light contact, just enough to feel the rifle without influencing it. The room had gone completely silent again. It had that particular quality now, learned silence, the kind that came from watching something done with such evident precision that noise felt like a form of interference. "Front axle is clear," Barrett said. "You've got your line." The rifle fired. The sound was the same, that hard concussive crack. And then the 9 seconds came again, or something close to it. And in the thermal scope, Barrett watched the lead vehicle in the convoy do something that vehicles did when an engine block took a precision round through its right front quarter at extreme distance. It lurched violently left, the front end dropping and swinging, the driver fighting it for approximately 2 seconds before losing the argument completely. And the truck came to rest crosswise across the narrowest section of the mountain road with its nose jammed against the rock face and its rear end hanging 6 inches from the drop-off. The road was blocked. "Hit," Barrett said, and then, after a beat, quieter. "Clean block. They're not getting around that." The convoy behind the lead vehicle braked hard. Through the thermal scope, small figures began appearing, fighters piling out of the troop carriers, moving to the front, trying to assess the situation. There was no panic yet, just confusion, and confusion bought time. "How long before they find another route?" Grant asked. Barrett studied the terrain on the overlay. That road is the only northern access to the valley floor. The next closest route comes from the east, but it's a 40-minute drive minimum on these roads. He looked up. We just bought 40 minutes. Grant looked at his watch. Bravo team had been inside the compound for 6 minutes. Mercer was presumably still alive. 40 minutes was not comfortable, but it was workable. And 10 minutes ago, nothing about this situation had been workable. He keyed the radio. Bravo team, Falcon. Northern threat is delayed. You have a window. What's your status? The response came back ragged with movement and breathing. Falcon. Bravo. We have eyes on the package. Room is clear. 2 guards down. Voss's second-in-command tried to lock himself in with Mercer. Sandoval put him through a door. We're cutting zip ties now. Condition of the package? Ambulatory, he's talking. Looks like they roughed him up some, but nothing critical. He's going to need medical attention, but he can walk. Copy. Get him moving. I want you at the extraction point in 8 minutes. Copy. 8 minutes. Grant set the radio down and allowed himself exactly 1 second of something that was not quite relief, but was in the neighborhood of it. Then he turned back to the room. Lena had come off the rifle. She was sitting back on her heels behind the position, notebook in her left hand, making notations in the small, clear handwriting that Caldwell had been studying for the past half hour. Her right hand was working some tension out of her shoulder. Not a dramatic gesture, just a person's body registering that it had been under sustained physical stress and was now catching up on the fact. Barrett was still on the secondary scope, tracking the blocked convoy. They're dismounting, he said. Looks like they're going to try to push the vehicle. Not going to work. It's wedged. Keep watching, Grant said. I want to know the moment they change approach. Sir, Rios had drifted to the equipment table without really deciding to, and he was standing near Lena's open rifle case, looking at the custom build she'd left resting in its foam cutouts when she'd come off the position. He wasn't touching it. He was just looking at it with the particular attention of someone who understood enough about precision weapons to recognize when they were looking at something genuinely unusual. The modifications were extensive. The barrel was clearly custom-made, not a commercial aftermarket component, but a purpose-built tube in a caliber that Rios didn't immediately recognize. The chassis had been reworked at the action, the bedding replaced with something more stable than factory spec. The scope mount was a zero-compromise unit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Specialist, Lena said without looking up from her notebook. Rios looked at her. Don't touch it. I wasn't going to. Good. He paused. Then, because he was 22 years old and the adrenaline of the last hour had apparently overridden his better judgment. Where'd you learn to shoot like that? Lena kept writing. Montana. Montana. He waited for more. There wasn't more. Like, what? Hunting? She looked up at him then. The look wasn't hostile. It wasn't warm either. It was the look of someone deciding whether a question deserved an answer, and arriving at a conclusion that was somewhere in the middle. Among other things, she said, and looked back down. Rios opened his mouth, closed it again, and went back to being quiet. From across the room, Caldwell was watching this small exchange, and he was thinking about 7 months. 7 months of walking past the same person at the equipment table, of answering questions about barrel temperatures and ammunition expenditure with the particular inattention you gave to someone you'd already categorized as not relevant to anything important. He was trying to remember if he'd ever had a conversation with Cross that lasted more than 2 minutes. He was fairly certain he had not. The radio crackled. Falcon Bravo, we are moving. Package is with us. Heading to extraction point now. Copy, Bravo. Helos are inbound. ETA, 14 minutes to the extraction point. Keep moving. Understood. The room shifted into a different mode, the specific organized tension of an operation that had turned a corner but hadn't finished yet. Grant moved to the main monitor and pulled up the extraction corridor overlay. The ground team's route from the compound to the landing zone crossed approximately 2 kilometers of rough terrain, and it had to do so in under 14 minutes with an injured civilian and full kit. It was possible. It was tight. It depended on nobody twisting an ankle and nothing going wrong in the dark. Lena stood up from behind the firing position and moved to the equipment table. She opened the rifle case and began the process of clearing and securing the weapon, removing the round from the chamber, checking the barrel, wiping down the exposed metal. She did it with the same unhurried thoroughness she brought to everything else, and nobody in the room interrupted her. Barrett came off the secondary scope. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment, and then he crossed to the equipment table and stood near Lena, not exactly next to her, but close enough that the proximity was intentional. She didn't look up from what she was doing. "The convoy is trying to organize a dismounted element," he said. "Send fighters down the hillside on foot. It won't intercept Bravo team in time, but I want you to know it's happening." "How many?" "Looks like 10, maybe 12. They're moving slow. The terrain on that hillside is rough." Lena considered this. "They're not going to reach the valley floor before the helicopters lift off." "No, but they'll get close." She secured the rifle case and latched it. Then she straightened up and looked at Barrett directly. It was a look that was doing several things at once, reading him, measuring the distance between who he'd been 2 hours ago and who he was being now, deciding what to do with both. "You were right about the convoy interdiction approach," she said, "targeting the machine." Barrett nodded once. "You were right about the wind layers." He paused. "I should have listened when you didn't know," she said. "You had no reason to think I could do any of that." "That's not entirely—" "It's true. I made a choice a long time ago not to advertise. That was my decision." She paused. "You worked with me once I started showing you what I had. That's what mattered tonight." Barrett looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face. Not quite guilt, not quite admiration, but something compound and real that had several things folded into it. Then he gave a short, single nod, and it meant something, and they both knew what it meant, and nothing further needed to be said about it. Grant was watching them from the main monitor. He filed it away. "Helos are 12 minutes out," Durkin called. "Bravo team is at the halfway point on the extraction corridor." "Copy." Grant moved to the radio. "Let's track them all the way home." The room settled into its final mode, watchful, quiet, counting the minutes. Through the north-facing scope, the dismounted fighters from the blocked convoy were picking their way down a hillside that was dark and rocky and not built for fast movement. Through the south-facing scope, the thermal signatures of Bravo team and their recovered diplomat moved steadily through a valley that was cold and dark and almost clear. Almost. Lena was standing at the secondary monitor, watching the Bravo team overlay when she stopped. Her eyes went to a section of the extraction corridor that was approximately 400 meters from the landing zone. She leaned slightly forward. "Colonel?" Grant crossed to her. She pointed at the monitor. At a position ahead of Bravo team's route, tucked against the base of a rock formation, that the thermal overlay was washing out slightly due to the rock's residual heat signature from the day. "There's something there," she said. Grant looked. The image was ambiguous. A soft thermal smear that could have been a cooling rock, could have been an animal, could have been the overlay artifact from the day's warmth bleeding out of the stone. Could have been. Could be nothing, Grant said. Could be a two-man position they pre-staged before the convoy moved, Lena said. If Voss was coordinating an ambush protocol, he'd want a blocking element near the extraction zone, trap the rescue team if they got through. Grant looked at the image, then he looked at Lena. You're reading an ambush into a thermal smear. I'm saying it's worth being sure about. A silence. Grant keyed his radio. Bravo team, Falcon. Slow your pace. Possible contact ahead of your position. 400 meters from the LZ at the rock formation on your left flank. Verify before you commit. The response took 4 seconds. Copy, Falcon. Slowing. Sergeant Reyes is on point. She'll check it. The room waited. Barrett had moved to the primary scope and was trying to get a visual on the rock formation. The angle was bad. The formation sat below the line of sight from the observation post, partially masked by intervening terrain. 40 seconds passed. Then, Falcon, Bravo. Reyes confirms. 2 personnel, prone, riffles. They're set up exactly on the approach line. Pre-staged ambush position. The room absorbed that. We're flanking now. Stand by. Grant lowered the radio slowly. He looked at the thermal smear on the monitor, the soft, ambiguous shape that Lena had pulled out of the overlay and turned into something that had just saved potentially several lives. He turned to look at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was watching the monitor, tracking the Bravo team signatures as they moved off the direct approach line and around the rock formation's flank. Cross, he said. She looked at him. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was a man who chose his words with the same deliberateness he applied to everything else, and right now the words he was reaching for were ones he didn't have a lot of practice with. "How long have you been running contingency calculations?" he asked. Not a rebuke. Genuine question. She held his gaze. "Since about 2 hours after we arrived on the ridge," she said. "Sir?" Grant looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the room, at Barrett on the scope, at Caldwell near the monitor, at Rios standing near the equipment table, and something moved across his face that was harder to read than anything else he'd shown that night. Then, from the radio, "Falcon Bravo, 2 enemy KIA. Ambush is cleared. We are proceeding to LZ. Package is still with us." Grant pressed the transmit key. "Copy Bravo. Helos are 9 minutes out. Keep moving." He set the radio down. Outside, the wind was still coming off the ridge in hard, irregular waves, still carrying ice and cold and the smell of high altitude and rock. The mountain didn't care what had happened inside the observation post tonight. It didn't register the 15 failed shots or the 3 successful ones, the blocked convoy or the cleared ambush. The woman at the back of the room who had spent 7 months being invisible and 6 hours making herself impossible to ignore. But the men in that room were going to carry it. Every one of them. The night on Blackstone Ridge was going to sit in a specific place in each of their memories for the rest of their lives. The kind of night that rearranged something quiet and fundamental in how a person understood what they thought they already knew. 8 minutes to extraction. In the valley below, a diplomat walked through the dark toward the sound of approaching helicopters, guided by soldiers who didn't fully understand yet what it had taken to keep him alive. In the observation post, Lena Cross stood at the secondary monitor and watched them move, her rifle case secured at her feet, her notebook in her hand, her face giving away exactly nothing. And somewhere on the northern hillside, 12 fighters picked their way through rock and dark toward a valley they were already too late to reach. The helicopters came in low and fast, 2 Blackhawks running without lights, navigating by terrain following radar and the coordinates Durkin had been feeding them for the last 6 minutes. Grant heard them before he saw them. A distant thumping that grew quickly into something that filled the valley and bounced off the rock walls and made the remaining fighters on the northern hillside stop moving and look up into a sky they couldn't read. The thermal scope showed Bravo team reaching the landing zone with 90 seconds to spare. Grant watched the signatures converge. 6 soldiers and 1 civilian, moving fast. The civilian's gait slightly off, but holding. The helicopters touched down in a swirl of rotor wash that the thermal overlay rendered as a blooming white distortion, and then the figures were loading, and then the birds were lifting, and then they were gone, climbing hard toward the northeast and the safety of altitude and distance. The radio crackled one final time. "Falcon Bravo, package is secure. All personnel aboard. We are feet wet." Grant keyed his transmit. "Copy Bravo." "Good work." He set the radio on the table and stood very still for a moment, and the room let him. Then he turned around and said to no one in particular, "Start breakdown. I want this position cleared in 40 minutes. They were off the mountain by 0630, 2 vehicles running south on a road that was barely wide enough for one. The kind of extraction that happened without ceremony, because ceremony was for when you were somewhere safe and warm and had time to think about what you'd just done. Nobody talked much. The cold had gotten into everyone during the long night, and the adrenaline had metabolized hours ago, leaving behind the specific exhausted flatness that followed sustained high-stakes work. Lena rode in the second vehicle, her rifle case between her feet, her notebook in her jacket pocket. She had her head against the window and her eyes open, watching the mountain pass by. Ice-covered rock and dark sky going slowly gray at the eastern edge. She wasn't asleep. She wasn't thinking about the shots. She was watching the mountain the way you watched something that had tested you and found out something about you. And you weren't entirely sure yet how you felt about being found out. Rios was sitting across from her. He'd been trying to sleep for the last 20 minutes and failing. He finally gave up and looked at her. "You okay?" he asked. She looked at him. "Yeah." "You don't look okay." "I'm tired." "You should sleep." "I know." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to anyway." He almost smiled. "The ambush position, the thermal smear, how did you see that?" She looked at him for a moment, then back out the window. Pre-staged ambush positions near an extraction zone. It's a specific tactical choice. It means somebody planned for the possibility that a rescue attempt would succeed, which means they had a protocol. which means they thought ahead. She paused. If you know someone thinks ahead, you look for the thinking. Rios processed that. And you just knew he thought ahead? Voss ran a competent operation for 4 years in hostile territory with limited resources. That doesn't happen by accident. She paused. People have patterns. Operations have logic. You pay attention long enough, you start reading both. Rios was quiet for a moment. Where'd you learn that? Montana? She looked at him again, and this time there was something in her face that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. Go to sleep, specialist. He went back to trying. Falcon Ridge Forward Operating Base sat in a shallow valley 40 miles south of Blackstone, a collection of prefab structures and reinforced personnel shelters surrounded by HESCO barriers and the particular organized clutter of a facility that had been temporary for so long it had achieved a kind of permanence. They rolled through the gate at 0712 and the base was already moving, personnel on the gravel paths, vehicles running, the smell of diesel and breakfast from the mess hall that hit everyone in the vehicles at roughly the same moment. The debrief was scheduled for 0900. That gave them time to eat, clean equipment, and sit somewhere warm for approximately 2 hours, which was not enough time to process anything properly, but was the Army's standard allowance for it. Lena went to the armory first. She always did. She stripped, cleaned, and inspected her rifle with the same unhurried precision she'd used in the field, logging the barrel condition and round count in the maintenance record she kept separate from the official armory logs. The official logs she also updated: barrel temperatures, ammunition expenditure, equipment condition, the work she was technically there to do, which she had not stopped doing even when everything else had changed. Caldwell came in while she was finishing. He stood in the doorway for a moment and she heard him and didn't look up, and he came in and sat down on the bench across from her workstation. I owe you an apology, he said. She kept working. You don't. Lena. She looked up. He almost never used her first name. She wasn't sure she'd heard him use it before tonight. 7 months, he said. I never once asked about your background. Never asked what you were trained in, what you knew, what you could do. He paused. That's not professionalism. That's negligence. She set down the cleaning rod. Master Sergeant, I made a choice when I joined this task force to do my job and keep the rest of it quiet. That was my call, not yours. The choice to keep quiet was yours. The choice not to ask, that was mine. He paused. And it almost cost Mercer his life. If you hadn't been running those calculations on your own initiative, but I was. Because you knew nobody was going to ask. The room was quiet. Outside, a vehicle started up somewhere and drove away, and the sound faded into the bass noise. Lena looked at him steadily. I spent a long time learning not to need people to ask, she said. I'm not saying that's healthy. I'm saying it's what I know. Caldwell held her gaze. Then he nodded, the kind of nod that meant he heard her and wasn't going to argue with what was true. You're being read into the primary operational roster, he said. Effective today. That comes from Colonel Grant. She didn't react visibly. Okay. Is that all you've got? Okay. What do you want me to say? He looked at her for a moment. I want you to say something that tells me you understand what happened up there last night. She picked up the cleaning rod again. I understand exactly what happened, she said. I took 3 shots that needed to be taken, and then I took several more. The mission was completed. The diplomat is alive. She paused. The rest of it is administrative. Caldwell stood up from the bench. He had the expression of a man who had started a conversation expecting one thing and gotten something that required recalibration. He moved to the door, then stopped. The custom rifle, he said. You built that yourself? Most of it. On an armorer's salary. I have priorities. He looked at her one more moment, then he left. Lena went back to cleaning. The 0900 debrief was standing room only, which was unusual for a task force of this size. Grant ran it himself, which was also unusual, and the fact that he had requested the full attachment, including technical support personnel, was not lost on anyone who had been paying attention to how task force debriefs were normally structured. Mercer was there, which was the most unusual thing of all. He was sitting in a chair near the front of the room with a bandage on his left cheekbone and a cup of coffee he kept lifting and not drinking. He He had showered and changed into borrowed clothing and looked like a man who was alive and understood that he hadn't expected to be, and was still working out what to do with the understanding. Grant put the mission summary on the screen, timeline, assets, engagement log, and walked through it in the crisp, factual manner that was his professional default. He didn't editorialize. He didn't frame. He let the data speak for itself. When he got to 0342 hours, the point in the timeline where Lena's name appeared for the first time, there was a shift in the room. Not dramatic, not loud, just an adjustment. The kind of collective reorientation that happened when a group of people were encountering information that required them to revise something. At 0342, Weapons Technician Cross assumed the primary firing position with a personally maintained precision platform and engaged the primary target at a range of 4,217 yards, Grant said. He clicked to the next slide. Subsequent to that engagement, she engaged 3 secondary targets at the compound, interdicted the lead convoy vehicle at the northern choke point, and identified a pre-staged ambush position ahead of Bravo Team's extraction route that had been missed by thermal overlay interpretation. He let that sit for a moment. Bravo Team's sweep of that position confirmed 2 enemy personnel in a pre-prepared firing point. They would have had a clear line on the extraction route. He paused. The package would not have reached the helicopters. The room was very quiet. Mercer was looking at Lena from across the room. She was sitting near the back, which was where she always sat, and she had her notebook open on her knee and was writing something that was probably unrelated to the praise currently being directed at her. She didn't look up. "I want to address something directly," Grant said. He moved away from the screen and faced the room. At approximately 0150, Technician Cross brought her firing calculations to my attention and volunteered to take the primary shot. The response from some personnel in that room was, let's call it, dismissive. He looked at no one in particular and everyone in general. I'm not here to assign blame for that. I'm here to tell you that dismissive was wrong, and I am going to be thinking about why it happened and what that says about how we operate as a team for considerably longer than this debrief lasts. I spoke him. Barrett was sitting 4 seats from Lena. He had his arms resting on his knees, and he was looking at the floor, and the quality of his stillness was the quality of a man doing something honest and uncomfortable in a room full of people. Questions? Grant said. There were questions, but they were mostly tactical. Verification of the atmospheric methodology, the convoy interdiction geometry, the ambush identification process. Lena answered them when they were directed at her, precisely and without additional material. She didn't explain more than what was asked. She didn't use the room's attention as an opportunity to say something she'd been waiting to say. Barrett asked one question near the end. He asked it without looking at her, addressing it to the room generally. The 6-layer wind calculation, is that a documented methodology or something she developed herself? Ask her, Grant said. Barrett looked at Lena. She looked at him. It's documented, she said. Long-range atmospheric ballistics research published in the last decade. Most people don't use it because the data collection requirements are intensive and the calculation time is significant. It's not practical in a dynamic shooting environment. She paused. It is practical when you have 6 hours to prepare and nobody's asking you to do anything else. Barrett nodded once and looked back at the floor. Mercer raised his hand. Grant acknowledged him. I'd like to say something, Mercer said. His voice was slightly rough, but it was steady. Grant nodded. Mercer turned in his chair to look toward the back of the room. I don't know the details of what happened on that mountain last night, he said. I know I was in a room waiting for something I'd stopped expecting to happen. And then it happened. He paused. I'd like to know who's responsible for that. Silence. Then Grant said quietly, Technician Cross. Mercer looked at Lena. She was looking back at him with the same neutral steadiness she brought to most things. And he held the look for a moment and then gave a single nod that was slow and deliberate and carried everything he couldn't put into words. Lena nodded back. Just once. The same way. The days after the debrief had a different texture. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody made speeches. Nobody issued formal declarations of changed behavior or revised attitudes. The task force was a professional organization, and it processed the events of Blackstone Ridge the way professional organizations process things that overturn their existing assumptions. through a series of small, quiet adjustments that accumulated into something different over time. Lena was aware of the adjustments. She couldn't have avoided being aware of them. They were directed at her, which meant they registered whether she wanted them to or not. People made eye contact where they hadn't before, asked questions that were genuine rather than perfunctory, said her name without the particular flatness that meant they'd attach no significance to the person behind it. She didn't distrust it. She also didn't lean into it. She kept doing her job, which now included her officially recognized role in precision fire support, and she kept her head down in the specific way she'd always kept her head down, which wasn't out of fear but out of habit. The habit of someone who had spent a very long time building something alone and still wasn't entirely sure what it meant to build it with other people. 6 days after the mission, a signals intelligence report came through that changed the tempo at Falcon Ridge. Voss was dead. That was confirmed and had been confirmed. But the intelligence suggested that the movement Voss had been running hadn't simply collapsed with him. It had fragmented into 2 distinct operational cells, one of which had been attempting to acquire a specific category of equipment that, if they succeeded, would upgrade their threat level from regional nuisance to something considerably more serious. The equipment in question was mobile, it was in transit, and the intelligence window on its location was narrowing. Grant called a planning session at 1400. The full operational element plus technical support. The planning session ran 3 hours, and by the end of it, the task force had a target, a timeline, and a series of problems that were familiar in their general shape but specific in their details. The target location was another mountain position. Different mountain, different terrain, but the same fundamental geometry. High altitude, extreme distance, hostile personnel, a limited window during which conditions were favorable. 48 hours to execute. It was during the second hour of the planning session that the problem emerged. The target location had a specific feature that made standard approach corridors impossible, a ridgeline that blocked line of sight from any conventional firing position within reasonable range. The only position that offered a clear shot required climbing approximately 800 meters of technical terrain to a secondary summit that nobody had confirmed as accessible, and doing it in a window of less than 6 hours before the target's movement pattern changed. Caldwell laid it out on the terrain model and then looked at the room and said, "Options." The room thought about it for a while. Various approaches were floated and examined and found wanting for various reasons. Grant listened to all of them without committing to any of them. Then Lena said, "The secondary summit is accessible." Everyone looked at her. She had the terrain model on her tablet and had been studying it quietly since the session began. She turned the tablet so the room could see the route she'd marked, a line that went up the eastern face of the ridge at an angle that looked, at first glance, close to vertical. "That's a technical climb," Caldwell said. "That requires equipment and experience we haven't confirmed. I've climbed that class of terrain before," she said. The eastern face looks steep on the model, but the rock type shows likely ledge formations every 30 to 40 meters. "It's manageable," she paused. 6 hours is tight, but workable if we move at the right time. "You've climbed that class of terrain," Caldwell said, and the way he said it wasn't disbelief exactly, but it was asking for something more. Lena looked at him. "Yes." "Where?" She held his look for a moment. "Montana and other places." Grant said, "What other places?" The room had gone quiet, in the way that rooms went quiet when something was about to open up that hadn't been opened before. Lena set the tablet on the table. She was quiet for a moment that wasn't hesitation. It was the pause of someone deciding something, drawing a line somewhere internal and choosing which side of it to step onto. "Before I was assigned to this task force," she said, "I spent 4 years under a special activities assignment in mountainous operating environments. 3 of those years were in theater. The other year was instructor work in terrain navigation and extreme environment marksmanship." She paused. "That assignment is the part of my file that's redacted." The silence that followed was the sound of an entire room revising a category. Barrett had turned from the terrain model and was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read and wasn't trying to be anything else. Caldwell had gone very still. Even Rios, who was sitting at the far end of the table and had no tactical reason to be this affected by the information, was staring. "Special activities," Grant said, flat, measured. "Yes, sir." "How long ago?" The assignment ended 14 months before I joined this task force. Why? He stopped himself. Restarted. Why armor assignment? After that? She looked at him steadily. Because I requested it. Grant held her gaze. Why? A pause. Because I needed to be somewhere that didn't require me to be what I'd been. Another pause, and this one had something in it that the others didn't. Something that wasn't armor, but was the thing underneath it. And because I thought that part was over. The room sat with that for a moment. Grant nodded slowly. And now? She looked at the terrain model, then back at him. And now we have a target on a mountain and a 6-hour window, and one person in this room who's confirmed the eastern approach is viable. She paused. So I'd say that part isn't as over as I thought. Grant looked at her for a long time. Long enough that it meant something. Then he said to the room, "We're going up the eastern face. Cross leads the climb and takes the firing position. I want a full support element planned for the valley approach and a contingency extraction route confirmed before 1800 tonight." He looked at Lena. "You briefed the climbing route after this session." "Yes, sir." He nodded and turned back to the terrain model. The planning session continued, but it had a different quality now. The particular quality of a room that had absorbed something significant and was moving forward with the new information integrated, operating from a revised baseline. The questions directed at Lena were different now, too. Not more deferential exactly. The task force wasn't a deferential culture, but more direct, more technical, more specific. They were asking about capability because they now understood there was capability there to ask about. She answered each question the same way she always answered questions, precisely, without elaboration, without performance. After the session broke, Rios caught up with her in the corridor. "Special activities," he said, matching her pace. "Yes, I know what it is. 3 years in theater." "Yes." He was quiet for a few steps. "Is that why you could read the ambush position? The pre-staged element near the LZ?" She didn't slow down. "That's part of it. What's the other part?" She stopped walking. He stopped with her. She looked at him with the particular patience of someone who had been answering questions for a week and was not annoyed by them, but was also not going to answer the ones that didn't have simple answers. "The other part," she said, "is that I paid attention for a very long time to things that nobody else thought mattered." She paused. "That's most of it, actually. The rest is just practice." Rios looked at her. "How much practice?" She started walking again. "Montana," she said, and left him standing in the corridor with a look on his face that meant he was going to be thinking about that answer for a while. Yeah, the night before the operation, Grant found her at the equipment table. It was past 2200. The base had quieted to its nighttime rhythm. Fewer voices, slower vehicle movement, the particular dimness of a facility running reduced lighting. She was at the armory workbench, field stripping and inspecting the climbing equipment that had been pulled from stores and supplemented with items she'd requested from a supply depot 2 hours south. Harnesses, anchors, a specific category of low-visibility rope that she'd specified by name and diameter. Grant stood in the doorway for a moment before she acknowledged him. "Sir," she said without looking up, "you should sleep." "I will." He came in and sat on the bench across from her, in the same spot Caldwell had used 6 days ago. She noticed but didn't comment. "I pulled your file," he said. "What I could access of it." She kept working. "I figured you would." "The redacted sections are significant." "I know. I can get red in clearance if I submit a formal request. It'll take time." "The operation is in 48 hours." "Yes." She looked up then. "Sir, I've told you what you need to know for this mission. The specific details of previous assignments aren't relevant to whether I can climb that face and make the shot." "I know that," Grant said. "That's not why I'm telling you." He paused. "I'm telling you because you've been sitting at the back of every room in this task force for 7 months, and the reason is in your file. And I think I owe you the fact that I know it exists even if I can't read it yet." Lena was quiet for a moment. She set down the carabiner she'd been inspecting. "The assignment ended badly," she said. "Not an explanation, just a fact." Grant waited. "Not the work. The work ended the way work ends. It was done, and then it wasn't needed anymore. Or they decided it wasn't, or the situation changed. She paused. The way it ended personally is what's in the redacted section. You don't have to. I know. She picked up the carabiner again. I requested the armorer assignment because I didn't trust myself to be in an operational role anymore. Not the shooting, not the climbing, the judgment part. She paused. I'd made a call at the end of the last assignment that I wasn't sure was the right call. I needed time to sit with that somewhere quiet. And Blackstone Ridge? She looked at him. Blackstone Ridge was the first time in 14 months that the answer was clear, she said. No ambiguity, no competing considerations. A man in a chair across 4 miles of mountain, and I could do something about it, or I couldn't. She paused. I could. Grant looked at her for a long moment. The call you weren't sure about, he said carefully. Did it work out? She held his gaze. The mission succeeded. The people I was responsible for came home. She paused. The judgment call? She stopped. I still don't know. Grant nodded. He understood the distinction. He'd lived it himself in different forms more than once. He stood up. Get some sleep when you're done here. Yes, sir. He moved to the door, then stopped. Cross. She looked at him. The redacted sections of your file, he said. Whatever's in them. It doesn't change what I know from this week. She held his gaze and didn't say anything, and after a moment, Grant nodded once and left, and the sound of his footsteps faded down the corridor and left her alone in the armory with the equipment and the silence and the 48 hours between now and the next mountain. She picked up the rope and began checking it, meter by meter, the way her grandfather had taught her, slowly, with full attention, not skipping any section because impatience was how you missed the thing that mattered. The rope was good, clean and strong throughout. She coiled it and set it with the rest of the equipment and went to get what sleep she could before the morning. The climb took 4 hours and 11 minutes. Not because the eastern face was forgiving. It wasn't. The rock was fractured basalt, cold enough that metal equipment stuck slightly to bare skin on contact, with ledge formations that looked solid from 20 feet below and revealed their true quality only when you weighted them. 3 times on the ascent, Lena found a hold that shifted under pressure and had to redistribute her weight in the dark with the particular controlled speed of someone who understood exactly how much margin she was working with. Each time she found the next hold without drama, without announcement, moving up the face the way water moved down it, along the line of least resistance, but steady and without stopping. Barrett was behind her on the rope. He climbed competently. He'd done mountain work before, though not at this technical level. And he understood rope discipline, which was the more important thing at altitude in the dark. He didn't crowd her. He didn't rush. When she stopped to reassess a section, he stopped and waited, and the only communication between them was the 2-tug signal on the rope that meant clear, move up, and the single tug back that meant on belay. Caldwell and 2 others were staged at the base of the eastern face with the support element, maintaining radio contact and tracking the target's last confirmed position through the drone feed Grant was running from Falcon Ridge. At 0412, Lena pulled over the lip of the secondary summit and lay flat for 30 seconds, breathing. Not recovering. She was in good condition, and the climb hadn't broken her. But taking the 30 seconds to let her heart rate settle before she started working, because precision and elevated heart rate had a specific relationship that she'd learned about 20 years ago and hadn't forgotten since. Barrett came over the lip 90 seconds later. He was breathing harder than she was. He rolled onto his back and looked at the sky for a moment, then rolled back over and got to work without being asked. They set the position in 11 minutes, low profile, minimal equipment signature, nothing that would read on a thermal scan from the valley below as anything other than cold rock. Lena had the rifle assembled and zeroed against the reference point she'd calculated from the terrain model before they left, and she was behind it and reading the atmospheric conditions while the valley below was still in pre-dawn dark. The target was in a structure 3,800 yards out. Not as far as Blackstone, but the terrain between them was more complex. Multiple ridge lines creating unpredictable wind shadows, a thermal effect from the valley floor that she'd had to model from incomplete data because they didn't have a weather station at the right altitude on this side of the mountain. Drone confirms target vehicle is still stationary, Barrett said, reading from the tablet connected to the feed. Structure on the south end of the compound, movement inside. Thermal shows 3 personnel. Which one is the primary? Can't differentiate from drone altitude. We need a visual ID window. How long until sunrise gives us enough light for optical? He checked. 38 minutes. She settled in. Then we wait. They waited. Barrett sat against the rock with the tablet on his knees and the rope still attached to his harness because there was a 600-meter drop 15 feet to his left, and he was experienced enough not to pretend that didn't matter. He watched the drone feed and reported position updates every 5 minutes and didn't fill the silence with anything unnecessary. At one point, around 0440, he said, "Special activities." Lena kept her eye on the scope. "What about it?" 3 years in theater. He paused. "That's not nothing." "No. Mountain environments." "Mostly." He was quiet for a moment. "What range were you working at out there?" She adjusted her scope a quarter turn. "Depended on the mission." "Longer than Blackstone?" She didn't answer immediately. Then, "Once." He absorbed that. "And you came back and requested an armorer slot?" "Yes." "That took—" He stopped himself, started differently. "I don't know if I could do that. Take a step back, that's significant." Lena was quiet for a moment. "It wasn't a step back," she said. "It was somewhere to be while I figured out if I still wanted to do this." "Do you?" She kept her eye on the scope. The valley below was still dark, still quiet. The compound 3,800 yards out, a cluster of thermal signatures in cold stone. "Ask me after this shot," she said. The window opened at 0518 when the light came over the eastern ridge and the optical scope resolved the compound in enough detail to read personnel movement. Barrett confirmed the primary target through the drone's camera zoom. A specific vehicle, a specific route from the structure to the vehicle, a figure that matched the intelligence profile. The window lasted, by their estimate, approximately 6 minutes before the vehicle would move. Lena had the firing solution calculated and was ready. And then the radio crackled. It was Grant's voice, but the quality of it was different from the planning sessions and the debrief, tighter, with something underneath it that Lena recognized as controlled urgency. "Cross, this is Falcon. We have a complication." She didn't move from the scope. "Go ahead." The signals intelligence team just pulled a second transmission from inside the compound. There are 2 civilian personnel in the structure. They came in last night, not on any prior surveillance. We don't know who they are. The transmission suggests they're there for a meeting, not as hostages, but we can't confirm their status before your window closes. Lena processed this in approximately 3 seconds. "Can you get a visual on their position inside the structure relative to the primary target?" "Drone thermal shows them in the northern room. Primary target's movement is taking him to the vehicle via the southern exit. They're separated, but the vehicle is adjacent to the southern wall, and we don't know where the civilians go when the primary starts moving," she said. "Correct." Barrett was looking at her. She wasn't looking at him. "The call is yours, Cross. You have the position and the optic. I don't." Grant saying that, putting it on her explicitly, from 40 miles away, was the kind of thing that either meant he trusted her completely or he understood that the person with the scope was the only person with enough information to decide. Probably both. She looked at the scope. The figure she'd confirmed as the primary target was crossing the courtyard now, moving south toward the vehicle. 2 other figures were visible at the northern window of the structure, standing, stationary, not moving toward the exit. "Barrett," she said, "northern room. Confirm the civilians are stationary." He was on the tablet, reading the drone thermal. "Confirmed, both stationary. Neither is moving toward the southern exit. How much separation between the primary target and the vehicle?" "He's at the vehicle now. Hand on the door." The window was closing. Once he was in the vehicle and moving, the shot became exponentially more complex, and the civilian risk profile changed entirely. She made the call. The rifle fired. The round traveled 3,800 yards through an atmosphere she'd been reading for 90 minutes and arrived at the vehicle's engine block. Not the driver, not the door. The engine block, front center, which rendered the vehicle non-operational instantly and simultaneously produced an effect that caused every person in that courtyard to go flat to the ground, including the primary target, who was still outside the vehicle, hand still on the door, when the engine detonated from the inside. "Target is down. Barrett said, reading the drone. He went flat. Wait. A pause. He's not moving. Cross the round. It didn't. Fragmentation from the engine block, she said. She didn't sound satisfied. She sounded clinical. How are the civilians? Drone shows them still in the northern room, not moving toward exits. I think they went flat too. A pause. They're okay. She came off the rifle, not with drama, just sat back on her heels and looked at the valley for a moment, then began breaking down the position. Falcon, cross. Target is neutralized. Civilians appear uncompromised, ready for extraction confirmation. Copy, Cross. Outstanding work. Extraction team is moving. How are you and Barrett? She looked at Barrett. He gave a thumbs up that was slightly shaky, which was honest. We're okay, she said. Starting descent. The debrief at Falcon Ridge ran 2 hours and 20 minutes, and it was different from the Blackstone debrief in ways that were hard to articulate, but immediately obvious to anyone who had been at both. The first difference was that Lena sat at the main table this time, not at the back. Grant had indicated her chair when she walked in, the same way he indicated chairs for the senior element leaders, and she had sat down without comment. The second difference was that the questions directed at her came earlier in the session and were more specific, not because anyone had decided to treat her differently as a gesture, but because the information she held was now understood to be operationally primary rather than supplemental. The third difference was Colonel Harlan Webb. Webb had arrived at Falcon Ridge while Lena and Barrett were on the descent. He was the task force's theater commander, 2 grades above Grant, a man who ran operational oversight from a facility 200 miles south and made his presence felt at forward positions primarily when something had happened that needed to be explained to people above his level. He was 54 years old and had the particular bearing of someone who had spent 3 decades being the most senior person in every room he entered, and he sat at the head of the debrief table with his hands folded and his face neutral, and his eyes moving between the briefing screen and Lena with an expression that was harder to read than Grant's. Grant ran the debrief. When he reached the second mission's operational summary, he covered the firing solution, the civilian complication, and the engine block engagement in the same factual register he'd used for everything else. Webb spoke for the first time. The decision to target the vehicle rather than the personnel that was made in the field, unilaterally, by Technician Cross. Correct, Grant said, without authorization from this command. The situation at this point of decision was a sub-30-second window with incomplete civilian position data. Field authority was Cross's. That's a significant engagement decision to be delegated to a technician. She's not a technician, Grant said. Flat, immediate. Not heated, but not negotiable either. Webb looked at him. She's been formally read onto the operational roster, effective 6 days ago. The designation is legacy. Her actual capability is considerably beyond the classification. Webb turned his attention to Lena. Walk me through the decision to target the vehicle. She looked at him directly. The primary target was outside the vehicle when my window closed. Targeting the vehicle's engine created a fragmentation effect that achieved neutralization without a direct personnel engagement, which reduced the risk of misidentification in low-light conditions with 2 unconfirmed civilian personnel 50 meters away. You made that calculation in under 30 seconds. The calculation had been running since I heard the complication report, she said. The 30 seconds was execution, not analysis. Webb studied her. You've done this kind of decision-making before. It wasn't a question. Lena recognized it as the probe it was. Yes, she said. In what context? The room had gone quiet. Grant was watching Webb. Barrett was watching Lena. Caldwell, sitting 2 seats down, had put down his pen. In a context that's currently in the redacted portion of my service record, Lena said, which I understand Colonel Grant has submitted a read-in request for. Webb's eyes moved to Grant. Grant nodded once. Webb looked back at Lena. What I can access of your file shows an armorer assignment dating back 14 months with clean performance reviews and no noted operational experience. He paused. What I can't access accounts for the 4 years prior. Yes, sir. 4 years in Special Activities Designation, Mountain Operations Environment. He said it the way someone said something they'd pieced together from partial information and were testing against the source. That's what we're talking about. Among other things. What other things? She held his gaze. The read-in request will cover it. Webb looked at her for a long moment, then, the engine block engagement. If the fragmentation hadn't achieved neutralization, if the primary target had survived and reached a secondary vehicle, what was your follow-on plan? I had one more round chambered and a clear line on the secondary vehicle's tires. He wasn't going anywhere. She paused. And I had 2 more windows on his movement pattern if he went back inside the structure. You'd calculated all of that before you fired. I don't fire without knowing what happens next. Webb was quiet. The room was quiet around him. Then he said to Grant, "What's her current designation on the operational roster?" "Precision Fire Support, Primary," Grant said. "Change it." Webb unfolded his hands and put them flat on the table. "I want a new designation drafted by 1800. I want it to reflect actual capability." He looked at Lena. "Which is going to require you to tell someone above my level what's in the redacted section." "I understand that." "Are you willing?" She was quiet for a moment. The moment that wasn't hesitation, but was the pause of someone who had lived on one side of a decision for 14 months and was now being asked to step across it. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." Webb nodded. And then, in the slightly awkward way of senior officers who were not accustomed to saying the next thing they were about to say, "The engine block call was the right call." He paused. "For what it's worth." Lena looked at him. "It's worth something," she said. The conversation with Barrett happened that evening, outside, on the gravel path between the armory and the personnel shelters. It was cold and getting colder, the sky clear and very dark above the base perimeter lights. He fell into step beside her, and they walked for a moment without either of them initiating anything. Then he said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say something for about a week." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. That's not the point." He was quiet for a step or two. "The night on Blackstone. When you came to the firing position and I said what I said about the shot being unsolvable, and then the room laughed." "Barrett, let me finish." He said it without edge. "I didn't laugh, but I didn't stop it either. And I've been sitting with that, and I don't have a good explanation for it. I had no information about your background, which is true. But the laugh was about something else. And I knew it was about something else. And I let it happen." She kept walking. The gravel was uneven, and she watched it for a moment. "What was it about?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, "You didn't fit the pattern of who's supposed to know things like that. And I think a lot of us, me included, had gotten comfortable with that being a rule instead of a habit." She was quiet. "That's not an excuse," he said. "That's just what it was." "I know what it was," she said. "I've watched it operate my entire career." She paused. "Every competition I entered under a false name. Every shooting record I set at a range where nobody knew who I was." Another pause. "It wasn't about not fitting the pattern. It was about the pattern being wrong. And nobody wanted to be the one who said so." Barrett walked beside her and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. After a moment, she said, "You stepped away from the position on Blackstone. You got on the secondary scope. You called the convoy choke point with me." She paused. "That mattered. It was the minimum, Cole." She used his first name without planning to. It stopped him slightly. "It mattered," she said. "People don't always get to the minimum. You did. That's not nothing." He looked at her. She was looking at the path ahead, not at him, and after a moment he looked ahead too. They walked in silence the rest of the way, and the silence had a different quality than the silences that had come before it. Not the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say, but the silence of 2 people who had said enough. Deb. Grant called her into his office at 2100. It was a small room, a prefab shelter fitted with a desk, 2 chairs, a wall of operational maps, and a coffee maker that ran continuously and produced something that qualified as coffee primarily by category rather than taste. He had 2 cups on the desk when she came in, and he pushed one toward her without asking. She sat down and picked it up. "Webb's office called," he said. "Read-in clearance came through in 4 hours. That's fast." "Yes, someone above Webb moved it." She didn't react. "Do you know who?" "I have a guess," she said. Grant looked at her. "Someone from the previous assignment." "Probably. Someone who's been watching this task force." She was quiet for a moment. I don't know that for certain, but you're not surprised. She held the coffee cup in both hands, the warmth of it against her palms, and looked at the map on the wall behind his head. When a special activities assignment ends, she said, it doesn't completely end. The people who ran it keep track. Not surveillance, just awareness. She paused. I think someone saw Blackstone Ridge in the intelligence summary and recognized the methodology. And made a phone call. Probably. Grant was quiet for a moment. The previous assignment. The call you weren't sure about. He said it carefully. I'm going to read the file. I'm not asking you to preempt it, but I want you to know that whatever's in it, it doesn't change the operational picture I have from the last week. She looked at him. You keep saying that. Because I keep meaning it. She set the coffee cup down. The call was about a target, she said. Not this category of target. She paused, finding the words that were accurate without being more than she wanted to give. A target where the intelligence suggested one thing, and my read of the situation suggested another. I made the call based on my read. The mission succeeded. But two people who weren't on the intelligence profile were in the location, and my call put them in a position that... She stopped. They survived, but it was closer than it should have been, given what I knew at the time. Grant was very still. I made a choice under pressure with incomplete data, and it almost went wrong in a way I couldn't have walked back, she said. And afterward, I couldn't tell if I'd made the best call possible with the information I had, or if I'd made a bad call that happened to work out. She looked at him. That's the part I needed the quiet armorer assignment to sit with. Have you figured it out? She was quiet for a moment. Today, on the summit, the civilian complication, the 30-second window. She paused. That was the same category of problem. And I made a different call than I made the last time, she said. Not because I calculated it differently, because I'd spent 14 months thinking about what I'd do if I was there again. Grant looked at her steadily. The call today was right. I know. Then you have your answer. She was quiet. The coffee maker behind Grant's head ran through a cycle and clicked off. Outside, someone crossed the gravel path and the footsteps faded. It's not that simple, she said. No, Grant agreed. It's not. He picked up his coffee. But it's a place to stand. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her cup again and held it. Outside, the base moved through its night cycle. Vehicles and voices, and the distant sound of a helicopter making an approach run. And inside the small prefab office, two people sat across a desk from each other and drank bad coffee and didn't say anything else. And the silence between them was the specific kind that came after something had been said that needed no addition. The read-in file arrived at Grant's desk at 06:30 the following morning, transmitted through a secure channel that required 3 separate authentication protocols and left no copy in the task force's standard document management system. He read it alone, with the door closed and the coffee maker running, and it took him 40 minutes because he read it twice, the first time for facts, the second time for what the facts added up to. When he was done, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. The file covered 4 years and 3 months of operational deployment across mountain environments in 2 separate theaters. It covered 31 precision engagements, 11 of which were at ranges that had no documented precedent in the Army's records at the time they occurred. It covered the training program she'd run for 18 months during the 3rd year. 12 operators who had gone through her instruction and whose subsequent field performance the file described in terms that were, for a military document, almost enthusiastic. And it covered the final assignment, the call she hadn't been sure about. Grant read that section 3 times. What she'd told him the night before was accurate as far as it went. What the file added was context, the specific intelligence failure that had put her in that position, the compressed timeline, the communication blackout that meant she couldn't reach her oversight chain, and the 2-person firing team that had been sent to the location independent of her operation without her knowledge, by a separate element that had been running a parallel track nobody had bothered to synchronize. The 2 people she'd almost put in danger hadn't been civilians in the conventional sense. They'd been the parallel team, sent in without coordination, on a timeline that crossed hers, by people who hadn't talked to each other before the operation launched. She'd made the right call. The file said so in the dry, factual language of an after-action assessment. The board that reviewed the incident said so. The officer who signed the final clearance said so. Nobody had apparently told her clearly enough that she was cleared, or if they had, she'd heard it and not believed it, which was a different problem entirely. Grant closed the file, finished his cold coffee, and went to find her. She was at the range. Not the task force's standard qualification range, the long-distance platform at the southern end of the base perimeter, the one that stretched out to 800 yards and was rarely used this early because the morning light came from the wrong angle. She had a lane to herself, and she was shooting at 500 yards, working through a series of positional exercises with a pace and precision that told him she'd been at it for a while. He stood at the range barrier and watched her for a few minutes without announcing himself. She was running a drill he recognized: fire, reposition, moving between 4 marked positions on the ground, each one requiring a different body orientation relative to the target. The drill was designed to train consistency across non-ideal firing positions, to develop the ability to get a good shot from a bad situation. It was a drill he'd seen taught in advanced precision schools, not something a standard armorer assignment would have put her through. She finished the sequence, cleared the rifle, and looked downrange at the target through a spotting scope. Then she made a notation in the notebook, which was sitting on the bench beside her. "Colonel," she said, without turning around, "how long have you been out here?" "Since about 5. She turned then. She looked like someone who had slept a few hours and decided that was enough. "You read it?" "Yes." She turned back to the target and looked through the scope again. "And? The board cleared you." "I know the board cleared me. The file is unambiguous about the parallel element. The coordination failure wasn't yours. The proximity wasn't your fault." She was quiet for a moment. Then she set down the spotting scope and looked at him. "I know what the file says." "Then what?" "I know what the file says, and I know what I was thinking when I made the call," she said. "Those are 2 different things. The file tells me the outcome was acceptable. It doesn't tell me my reasoning was sound." She paused. "I made that call fast, and I was confident, and I didn't have all the information. I was confident when I didn't have all the information." She looked at him steadily. "That's the part that put me in the armorer slot, not the outcome." Grant held her gaze. Overconfidence, or just confidence without the right calibration. "I'd been operating alone long enough that I stopped accounting for the variables I couldn't see. I assumed I had the full picture." She paused. "Yesterday, on the summit, the civilian complication, I had Barrett on the drone feed giving me real-time data, and I still took the extra 3 seconds to ask him to confirm the northern room." She looked back toward the target. "That's different from who I was on the last assignment." Grant was quiet for a moment. "Is it enough?" She looked at him. "Enough for what?" "For you to trust yourself again. Fully." She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the range, at the 800-yard line where the targets were barely visible as shapes, and she was quiet long enough that a lesser person might have tried to fill it with something. "Ask me in 6 months," she said. Grant nodded. He thought that was probably the most honest answer she could give him, and he respected it more than he would have respected certainty. "Webb's designation request," he said. "It came back this morning. Counterproposal from Theater Command." She looked at him. "They want to attach you to the Army's Precision Skills Development Program," he said. "Permanent cadre. You'd be building curriculum and running instruction for senior-level precision training." He paused. "It's not a field assignment. It's a teaching role." She was quiet. "You'd be the first person in that role with a special activities background. The file suggests it's been a gap in the program." He paused. "It would mean leaving this task force." She looked at the range for a long time. "What do you think?" "I think you've spent 14 months doing a job below your capability to process something that the file already processed 2 years ago," he said. "I think the field is where you're best, but I also think what you know is worth passing on, and the program doesn't currently have anyone who can pass it on the way you can." He paused. "What do you think?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think I'm not ready to make that decision this morning." "That's fair." "I also think—" She stopped, started again. "I think when I joined this task force, I told myself the operational part was done, and then Blackstone Ridge happened, and the summit happened, and I don't know anymore if I was right about that or if I was just—" She stopped again. "Hiding," Grant said. Not unkind, just direct. She looked at him. Maybe, she said, or resting. I'm not sure there's a clean line between them. Grant nodded. Take the time, he said. The program offer doesn't expire immediately, but they want an answer inside 30 days. Understood. He started to leave, then stopped. Cross. He looked back at her. The 4 years in the file, 31 engagements, the instruction program. He paused. Those aren't the record of someone whose judgment failed. They're the record of someone who held an impossible standard for 4 years and then held herself to a higher one when something felt slightly off. He paused. That's not a flaw. That's the rarest thing I've seen in this work. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her face. Not tears, not close to tears, but the visible evidence of something shifting, quietly, in a place that had been locked for a while. Thank you, sir, she said. He left her at the range, and she turned back to her rifle, and behind her the base was waking up to another morning in a forward position that was cold and remote and nothing like home. It was Rios who told her about Barrett. She'd come off the range at 0900 and was in the armory doing inventory. The work that still existed regardless of what else had changed, because rifles still needed to be logged and ammunition still needed to be tracked, and the Army's paperwork waited for no one. When Rios appeared in the doorway with his hands in his jacket pockets and the expression of someone delivering news he'd been rehearsing, Barrett submitted a formal statement to the after-action record, he said. About Blackstone. She looked up from the inventory log. He documented the initial response in the observation post, Rios said, when you volunteered for the shot. He specifically documented the dismissal and his own role in not countering it. He paused. He submitted it as an official record, not just debrief commentary. It goes into the permanent file. Lena looked at him for a moment. That was his decision to make. I know. I just thought you'd want to know he made it. She looked back at the inventory log, then back at Rios. Why are you telling me? He shrugged, slightly awkward. Because I was one of the people in that room, and I didn't do anything either, and He stopped. I'm not going to submit a formal statement because I'm a specialist and nobody needs my documented remorse, but I wanted you to know that I know. She looked at him. He was 22 years old and embarrassed and sincere, and the sincerity was harder to deflect than the deference she'd been navigating for the past week. Okay, she said. Okay? Yes. Okay. She paused. Rios, you asked better questions than most people 3 times your rank. That's not nothing either. He absorbed that. Then he gave a small nod that was slightly too large to be casual and left. She looked back at the inventory log. The armory was quiet around her, the particular quiet of a room full of equipment that was dormant, waiting. She'd spent 7 months in this room, and most of those months she'd been grateful for its uncomplicated nature. Rifles didn't form opinions about who maintained them. Ammunition logs didn't have anything to prove. But she'd also spent those 7 months running contingency calculations on a notepad and maintaining a custom rifle nobody had asked about, and training in the dark when the base was asleep, and reading atmospheric data out of habit, even when there was no mission using it. She hadn't stopped being what she was. She'd just stopped letting it show. That wasn't peace. That was something closer to suspension. She closed the inventory log, capped the pen, and stood up. Webb's formal statement came through the task force distribution at 1400 that afternoon, and it was the kind of document that did quiet but permanent damage to certain institutional narratives. It was titled simply as a command assessment, addressed to theater leadership and copied to the Army's personnel command. It summarized the Blackstone Ridge operation and the second mission, and it was factual in the way that documents written by people who understood the weight of facts were factual, spare, specific, and without any obvious effort to editorialize. But the final section wasn't spare. The final section described a systemic failure that Webb called by its name without softening. Qualified personnel operating below their confirmed capability level due to institutional assumptions that had no documented basis, and that had, in this specific case, nearly cost an American diplomat his life. He named no individuals except Lena, and he named her not as a subject of failure, but as evidence of what the failure had cost, and what competent leadership had, in the end, recovered. The recommendation at the bottom called for a review of assumption-based personnel categorization across forward-deployed task forces. It called for mandatory capability disclosure protocols during onboarding, and it called specifically for a review of the Precision Skills Development Program's criteria for senior cadre selection. Lena read it on a tablet in the mess hall, alone at a corner table with coffee she was actually drinking this time. She read it twice, the way Grant had read the file. First for facts, second for what the facts added up to. Then she closed the tablet and sat with it. The statement didn't fix what had happened. It didn't retroactively change the 7 months, or the 15 failed shots before hers, or the laugh in the observation post that Barrett had let pass. It didn't change the 4 years of competitions under false names, or the years before that on a Montana ranch being taught by a man who knew she was exceptional and couldn't figure out what to do with the knowledge in a world that wasn't ready for it. It was a document. Documents didn't fix things. They recorded them, officially, in a way that made them harder to unsee. That was enough. Caldwell sat down across from her without asking. He put his own coffee on the table and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You read it," he said. "Yes. Webb doesn't write documents like that often." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "The program offer," he said. "Teaching assignment. Grant told you." "Grant tells me things. I'm the master sergeant." A pause. "What are you going to do?" She looked at her coffee. "I don't know yet." "What does your gut say?" She looked up at him. "My gut says the field is where I function best." But I spent 4 years in a special activities assignment, and the only person who knew what I'd learned was me." She paused. "That's a waste." Caldwell was quiet. Then, "Both things can be true." "I know. Field assignment with instructional duties attached. It's not unheard of." She looked at him. "Are you negotiating on behalf of the task force?" "I'm negotiating on behalf of Practical Sense," he said, "which, as Master Sergeant, is my actual job." He paused. "You're better at this than anyone we have. The program needs what you know, and this task force is better with you in it." He shrugged. "Figure out a way to do both, or figure out which one you need more. But don't disappear back into an armory." She held his gaze. "I wasn't planning to." "Good." He picked up his coffee. "That's settled then." She almost smiled. "That's not how decisions work." "That's exactly how decisions work," he said. "You've already made it. You're just filling in the details." She looked at him for a moment, and the thing that almost became a smile became it. As the last evening at Falcon Ridge, before the task force rotation that would move most of the personnel to new assignments. Lena was in the armory packing her rifle case when Barrett came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, like Grant had weeks ago, and she heard him and didn't look up, and he came in and sat on the bench and watched her work. "I heard about the program offer," he said. "News travels. Small base." A pause. "Are you taking it?" She closed the case and latched it. "I'm recommending a hybrid structure. Instructional curriculum development with field attachment maintained. They'll either agree or they won't." "That sounds like something you'd propose." "It's the right solution." He was quiet for a moment. "I also heard you're writing the atmospheric ballistics methodology into a formal training document," he said. "The 6-layer calculation. It should have been documented years ago. It wasn't because nobody who knew it had the clearance level to publish it in the right context." She paused. "Now I do." Barrett nodded. Then he said, "I want to say the thing I've been trying to say correctly for 2 weeks." She looked at him. "I don't think what happened on Blackstone, the initial response, the dismissal, was just about you not fitting the pattern," he said. "I think I was the best shooter on that mountain, and I'd failed 14 times. And when you stepped forward, it meant that either you were capable of something I wasn't, or you were about to fail in front of everyone." He paused, and I think part of me was hoping for the second one, because the first one required me to revise something I'd built my entire career on. "Boys, try, boy." She was quiet. "That is harder to admit than the other thing," he said. "I know it is," she said. "That's why it matters more." He looked at her. She looked back at him, and for a moment the armory was very quiet. Just the two of them and the equipment and the weight of the thing he'd just said, which was honest in the specific uncomfortable way that honesty was when it cost something. "You're a good shooter," she said. "You were the best in the room before Blackstone." And after? After you're a good shooter who knows how to work with someone better than you. She paused. That's actually more valuable in the field. He looked at her for a moment. Then something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, but the real thing underneath the smile. Is that supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to be accurate. He stood up. Good luck with the program, he said. And with the hybrid structure. Good luck with the next rotation. He moved to the door, then stopped. He didn't turn around. Montana, he said. Your grandfather. The shooting training. Yes. He knew what he had. She was quiet for a moment. He told me once that the hardest thing about having an ability nobody else could see was learning to be patient with the world while it caught up. She paused. He said it always caught up eventually. Barrett stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. Then he left, and his footsteps went down the corridor and faded, and Lena stood in the armory alone with her rifle case and the inventory logs and the quiet. She picked up the rifle case. She turned off the light. She walked out. 6 months later, the Army's Precision Skills Development Program received a new methodology document that reorganized the foundational curriculum for long-range marksmanship instruction. The atmospheric calculation framework it introduced became standard curriculum within a year. The first class to train under the revised program posted record qualification scores across 7 out of 12 skill categories. The author of the document was listed in the program records as a senior cadre instructor on hybrid field instructional attachment. Her official designation had been revised 3 times since Falcon Ridge, each revision reflecting something the one before it hadn't fully captured. On the day the first revised curriculum class completed their final qualification, she was on the range with them, not watching from the back, standing at the line behind her own rifle, demonstrating the final sequence of the course of fire the way she always demonstrated it, by doing it once, without announcement or setup, letting the result speak before she said a word. The round went where the round was supposed to go. The class watched the target, and then watched her, and then looked at each other with the particular expression of people who had just encountered a new outer limit of what they'd understood to be possible. She cleared the rifle and looked at them. Questions, she said. There were always questions. There would always be questions. That was the point. That evening, she sat outside the range facility in the late light and wrote a letter she'd been writing in her head for 6 months. To the grandfather who had handed her a rifle when she was 7 years old, and said, with the particular patience of someone who saw further ahead than most people, "You'll have to wait for the world to be ready. But don't you ever stop getting ready for it." She'd been ready for a long time. The world had caught up. The people who underestimate you are not always your enemies. Sometimes they're just people who haven't seen enough yet. Keep working. Stay patient. Let what you build in the quiet speak when the moment finally comes. Because the moment always comes, and it always finds exactly the person who is ready for it.